Hi, welcome to another exciting Unity tutorial with me, Romy Fauzi. This is the updated 2D platformer using Playmaker 2020 version. In this tutorial, I'll explain how to create a 2D platformer in Unity using Playmaker. Playmaker is a visual scripting add-on for Unity, and first, I'll show you the initial setup of the player object, animator, and the environment. And I'll include the assets in the descriptions below. For the character asset, called Pilot Boy, it consists of sprite for animations such as idle, run, and jump. And if we select the player game object, you see it have a rigid body 2D and a capsule collider 2D attached to it. And the actual sprite is attached on the child object of this player game object. Now, if we select the child game object, the one with the sprite renderer, and then open the animation panel, it has three animations, which are idle, jump, and run. I'll play each of the animation. This is the idle one, and this is the jump, and the last one is the running animation. And if we check the animator states under the animator panel, you'll see the default states is the idle state, and it have transition to the run state and vice versa. The transitions are triggered by float parameter called speed. And here we can see for the idle to run transition, it checks if the speed value is greater than 0.1. Then we want to transition from idle to run animation. And if the speed is less than 0.1, then we want to go back from run to idle. And in both of the condition, we need to disable the has exit time option. And for jump, we are using the jump trigger. And we can create a transition from any state to the jump and use the jump trigger as a condition. I also disabled the has exit time. And for getting back from jump to the idle or run, we create two transitions, one to the idle, second one to the run. And for the transition, we set the isGrounded boolean to true. So if during runtime, the isGrounded boolean are changed to true and the speed less than 0.1, then we want to go back to idle. And for the jump to run transition, we also set the isGrounded to true, but we set the speed greater than 0.1. This is the animator setup, and I've shown you also the character setup. And for the environment, I've downloaded the free asset from Asset Store, and I've searched it using the keyword 2D tile. I've enabled the free assets options. Scroll down and until I found the 2D jungle side scroller platformer pack. So you can download it yourself and then put the assets in your scene to lay out the environment. I also prepared the empty game object for grouping the collider, and I've put the base ground collider here, as you can see here. And now we can start work on the visual scripting using Playmaker. So in order to work on the visual scripting, let's just select the player under the Playmaker window. We can right click to add a new FSM. And I'm going to call this FSM movement. And in the first state, I've renamed the name also to movement. And for the movement, we are going to use the get axis action. And this is like an input get axis method. For the axis name, we need to fill it horizontal to refer the input settings on the project settings. And for the multiplayer, you can set whatever value that you want. For example, I'm going to set this U3. And we need to store the result from this guess axis to a new variable. So let's just create a new variable, and I'm going to call this move speed. This will create a new variable in the variable tab. And make sure the every frame options is checked, so the action gets executed every frame. And the next action that we need to add is the set velocity 2D. There is an issue here because I accidentally create the FSM on other object. So I'm going just to copy the component and paste it on the player. And I'm going to remove the one that it's on the collider. So to continue this, I'm going to set the vector to use variable, so we won't be modifying the vector. And we want to assign the move speed variable to the x component of the set velocity to the action. and make sure the every frame is also checked. And this will move our player, but the animation won't work yet. So in order to make the animation work, we need to duplicate the float variable, the move speed variable, to a new variable. So I'm going to create a new variable inside this set float value, and I'm going to call this speed absolute. And we need to assign the speed absolute value to the move speed value that we've generated using the get axis action. And make sure every frame is also checked. And after that, let's add a new action. And we need to convert this speed to an absolute value. So it's going to be always positive, the speed absolute value, regardless of the direction of our movement. So now let's assign the speed absolute value as the variable of the float absolute action, and make sure the every frame option is checked also. And then the next action that we want to add is the set animator float. And it requires an object to have animator components attached to it. So let's just specify a game object, a separate game object, and we want to drag the pilot boy game object, the child game object. And for the parameter, we can check on the animator. Under the parameter tabs, we want to modify the speed parameters. So let's just remember the name and type it. And it is case sensitive, so make sure the capitalization is correct. And we want to set the speed absolute as its value and also every frame checked. So now if we press play, you'll see that when we moving, the animation is playing, and if we stop, it is playing the idle animation. But we need to add a new FSM to make sure the player can flip if it's moving to the other direction. Okay, so now for the flip FSM, let's create a new FSM, and I'm going to call this FSM direction. And for the state, we want to change the first one to face right. And for facing right, we want to lock the Playmaker window so we can select other object, and I want to set the properties of the sprite render component on the child object. So let's just drag the sprite renderer to the state window and choose the set property option. And for the property, we can select lots of properties here. We want to modify the flip X property. And for facing right, we don't want to change the set value. So just leave it unchecked, because by default, the sprite is facing right. And we need to also add the get axis action. And for the axis name, we are going to use also horizontal. And the multiplier, we are going to put a same value with the movement FSM, which is 3. And let's just create a new variable, move speed, for storing the get axis, because variable only available on its FSM. And the next action that we need to add, we want to add an integer clamp, and we want to clamp the variable. Sorry, it needs to be a float clamp, so I'm going to change the action, search for float clamp, and for the variable, it's the move speed variable. We want to set the minimum value to -1 and the maximum value to 1, and every frame also checked. And we need to convert this float to an integer. So let's add a float to in action and select the move speed and convert this to a new integer variable. So let's just create a new variable, and we can call this direction, and every frame also checked. We need to convert this to integer, so the value is rounded. And we want to compare this integer using the integer switch. So let's just assign the direction for the integer variable. We want to compare the integer. If the direction is -1, then we want to send the state to another event. And let's copy the face right state here and paste it here and select no, so it won't be a start state. And I'm going to change the second state to face left. And for this state, we want to set the property its value to check. So just check the set value option, so it will flip the sprite when the flip X gets checked. And for the integer switch, we want to check if the direction value is 1. So for this integer switch, we need to create 2 new events, turn left, and the other one, turn right. So we are going to switch this state over and over depending on the direction. So add the turn left event to the face right state, and then connect this to the face left state. And if we are currently on face left state, we want to add the turn right and then connect the turn right event to the face right. And we want to set the integer switch event for the face right state to turn left and every frame checked. And for the face left, we want to set this to send event to turn right event and also check the every frame. And now let's save this and test this out. And you'll see that if we move to the right, the character is facing to the right, and if we move to the left, the character is also facing to the left. For the next FSM, we want to create a jumping FSM. So let's just create a new FSM, and let's call this FSM jump. And for the state, we are going to wait for an input. So let's just call this wait for input, and the state will wait for a jump button input. And we can use a get button down action. And for the button name, we can just set this to jump, and it's assigned to spacebar by default by Unity. And let's create a new event called do jump. And we want to send that event, and we add the transition do jump to the wait for input state. And let's add a new state, and let's just call this jump. And we want to add a set velocity 2D, and we want to set a certain value in the y component, for example 6, but we don't want to check every frame because we want this to happen only once. And connect the do jump event to the jump state, and after jump we want to add a finish transition, and we need to create a new state and connect finish to the new state. And this state is for checking whether the player is falling or not. And for checking this out, we need to use the get velocity 2D, and then we want to grab the y component. So let's just store this to a new variable. Let's just call this y speed and check the every frame option. And next, we need to add a float compare action. And here we want to compare the y speed using float compare action. So we can assign the y speed as the first float. And for the second float, we can just set this value to negative 0.5. And we want to check if this value is less than negative 0.5. Because if the value is in negative area, for example, is smaller than negative 0.5, then it means that the player is currently falling. And we need to create a new event called isFalling. And we want to set this isFalling as the less than event, and make sure that every frame is also checked. So we only want to wait until the y speed is negative and then go to the next state to check against collision with the ground. So let's just add the isFalling event, and let's create a new state, and let's call this check if landed. Let's just connect the isFalling event to the new state, and I'm going to create a new event called has landed, and we can connect the has landed event to the wait for input. And this mechanism for preventing double jump. So in the check if landing state, we need to add a collision to the event. We want to use the on collision enter method, and for the tag we need to add a certain tag, and I'm going to add ground. And we need to make sure that the ground collider also set to ground, so it will only detect against that specific object. And if it's happened, then we want to send the event has landed, and it will goes back to the first state. And let's just save this and let's test this out. Now we can jump, but the animation is still using the walking animation. So we need to fix this. And for setting the animation for the jumping feature, we can add a set animator trigger on the jump state. And if we see the animator, you see that from any state to jump, we need to trigger the jump condition. So we can just select specify game object under the set animator trigger and drag the child object. And we want to trigger the jump trigger. And we want to also set the boolean on our animator, which is the isGrounded boolean to false, because whenever we start on this state here, our player is starting to float. So let's just drag the pilot boy and change the isGrounded parameter and set the value to true. Sorry, set the value to false. And we want to copy this set animator bool action, and let's just put this inside the wait for input, because whenever we collide with the ground, then we are entering the wait for input state. So let's just set this back to true inside the wait for input state. And now let's save this and test this out. And you'll see whenever we jump, it plays the jump animation. And if I move and then try to jump, it will still also play the jump animation. Another thing we can do is we can create a one-way platform for the back blocks here. So the player can jump from the lowest ground to the above ground here. And we can add a new empty game object under the collider groups. And let's add a edge collider. And we need to set the length of the collider using the edit collider. And let's just reposition the vertex to cover the ground approximately. And then turn off the edit collider so we can adjust the position of the game object so it aligns with the ground. And we need to set this collider also to a ground for the tag so the collision event can read that. And we need to add a platform effector to the component in order to make this collider as a one-way platform. And for using the platform effector, we need to enable the use effector option under the edge collider 2D. And we can see the gizmo in our scene here. We need to decrease the surface arc value to around less than 180, for example 170, so we can define the radius angle in which the player can land on this platform. So it means that the player has to land from above, and we can go through from the sideways. And you see here, if I fall down, we can move to the ground here, to the ground below. So the collider won't stop the player from going in, but we can jump back to the platform above. And the last thing that we need to add is we need to add a FSM to the main camera. And let's just call this FSM camera follow. And we only need one action, but we need to download this action from the ecosystem add-on. So you can just download the ecosystem add-ons and install it into your project. And once it's installed, you will have this add-ons ecosystem options, and you can open the ecosystem browser. And here inside the ecosystem browser, let's search for camera follow. And for the result, you see I have already imported the camera to the smooth follow. But if you haven't downloaded, you'll see the get button, just like the float follow here above. And now once imported, you can search for the camera to the smooth follow. And we need to add this action to the state here. And we want to move the camera, so we need to set the setup game object to the main camera. So let's just drag the main camera to the game object slot and drag the player to the target game object. And I'm going to set the X offset to 0 and the Y offset to 0.25. Oh, sorry. We need to assign the game object to main camera, but the target game object to the player. And now make sure the follow X option and the follow Y option are both checked. And let's press play to test this out. And you see now the camera will move to follow the player. But I've set up the X offsets wrong, so I need to change the X offsets to 0.5. And this is for offsetting the X position of the camera, as you can see here. So set this back to 0.5. And now if we move, the camera is following the player. And there's one thing that we can fix here. As you can see here, if we move further to the right, we can see the blue color of our default background. Because our sky size is only this big here. In order to fix this, we can just fix the jungle sky here by dragging the game object to be the child of the main camera. And now it will follow the camera wherever camera goes. So it will stay behind the camera. Oh, I forgot to set the X offset when we stop the gameplay. So we need to set this back. So now if I go much further to the right, you see that the sky stays. So that is basically how to create a 2D platformer with Playmaker.